Welcome back everybody to part 3 of this series on Herodotus of Halicarnassus, following him book by book as he makes his way through history. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2 yet, it's a good idea, they're worth a watch. But if you've forgotten what happened in those videos, after all it has been a whole week, here's a quick recap. In book 1, we learned about the rise of the Persian Empire under Persia's first great king, Cyrus the Great. Cyrus conquered a great empire, subjugating his neighbours and incorporating them into Persian rule before overreaching and being killed in battle. In Book 2, we learned about the country of Egypt, a part of the world that was already filled with ancient history, even in Herodotus' day, and we followed this Greek tourist as he explored the country and learned about its wonders. This week, we will follow the new king of Persia, Cambyses, as he invades and conquers Egypt before losing his mind. Book 3 is very much about the corrupting nature of power. It deals with several rulers whose absolute authority eventually wears away at their humanity, and ultimately they all come to bad ends. In this book we hear about Polycrates of Samos, the pirate lord who ruled over the Aegean until his famous good luck finally ran out, and he died a horrible death. We also learn about Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, who murdered his own wife in cold blood and held on to power with an iron grip. But eventually, his cruelty caught up with him. His own son was turned against him, and his family was torn apart. But Herodotus' poster boy for the corrupting nature of power is Persia's second king, the eldest son of Cyrus, Cambyses, the king who will conquer Egypt. Herodotus gives us 3 stories as to why Cambyses chose to attack Egypt. The story that the Egyptians themselves tell is that Cambyses, the king of Persia, was himself half Egyptian. He was the son of Cyrus, king of Persia, and an Egyptian concubine, and his attack on Egypt was some kind of birthright claim. But Herodotus says that this is absolute nonsense. Everybody knows who Cambyses' mother was, and she was a Persian just like his father. Herodotus' favourite of the 3 stories is the one that the Persians tell. They say that Cambyses wanted a Persian concubine, so he sent a message to Pharaoh Amasis of Egypt, asking for one of his daughters to marry. And this put Amasis in a little bit of a predicament. He didn't want to send one of his daughters to Persia to be a concubine of the great king, but he knew that if he refused, it might be taken as an insult, and Cambyses might use this as a pretext for war. So he tricks the king of Persia. Instead of sending his own daughter, he sends the daughter of the previous king of Egypt, who he had overthrown. You know, she'd been a princess before, she knew how to play the part. Cambyses would be none the wiser. But one day, this girl reveals to Cambyses that he's been tricked, that she isn't the daughter of the sitting pharaoh at all, and realizing that he's been deceived, Cambyses flies into a murderous rage and vows to take revenge on Egypt. There is a 3rd story that Herodotus doesn't believe, but he tells us anyway, and in this version it is not Cambyses, but his father, Cyrus, who marries an Egyptian princess, and he becomes utterly besotted with her, so much so that he starts neglecting his other wives, including Cambyses' mother, Cassandra. And Cambyses, seeing that his mother is becoming depressed, goes to her and vows that when he grows up, he will go to this woman's country of Egypt and turn it upside down. This is typical of Herodotus, in case you hadn't noticed. The motivations behind war and peace are very rarely political or economic. They are personal. The rule of kings and the shapes that their countries take are tied intimately to those rulers' character, their relationships, their morality, and their fate. Cambyses, with the help of his Greek and Arab allies, invades and conquers Egypt. Now Amasis, the pharaoh who had insulted him, had already died at this point, so the pharaoh that Cambyses deposes is his son, Psammetichus, and in the immediate aftermath of the Persian victory, we get our first taste of just how cruel Cambyses could be. Cambyses declared that for every 1 Persian that died in the invasion, 10 Egyptians must die. He then hauls out the pharaoh Psammetichus and the nobles and aristocrats of Egypt and places them where they can watch as the Egyptian prisoners are marched to their execution. When they see their sons being taken to their death, with bits in their mouths and ropes around their necks, the Egyptian nobles begin to weep. But when the pharaoh Psammetichus saw his own son leading the procession of the condemned, he didn't react. And then the girls were brought out, the young daughters of the Egyptian nobles, dressed as slaves and ready to serve their new Persian masters. The nobles began to weep even harder, seeing their daughters being treated this way. But yet again, the pharaoh did not react. But then Psammetichus saw an old friend of his, dressed in rags like a beggar, and asking for food from the Persian army. And seeing this, the pharaoh finally broke down into tears, a reaction that slightly confused Cambyses, who sent a messenger to ask him this. "Your master Cambyses wants to know, Psammetichus, why the sight of your daughter being humiliated and your son being taken to his death did not move you to protest in tears, whereas a beggar who, he has been informed, is not related to you at all, did receive this mark of respect from you." Pharaoh responded, "Son of Cyrus, my personal troubles are too immense to cry over. But when a friend on the threshold of old age has lost a fortune and happiness and been reduced to beggary, his sorrow calls for tears." This wisdom from the pharaoh moves Cambyses to mercy, and he decides to spare Psammetichus. He also tries to spare Psammetichus' son, but it's too late. The Egyptian prince was the first one to be put to death amongst the group of noble children. Herodotus speculates that if Psammetichus had chosen to accept this mercy and, rule peacefully, he'd have probably ended up back in charge of Egypt in no time. That's just how the Persians liked to do things. They liked to use local rulers to rule their lands on their behalf. But Psammetichus just could not resist trying to rebel against Persia. His conspiracy is discovered before it can get off the ground, and he takes his own life. So died Psammetichus, the last pharaoh of an independent Egypt, until the 28th dynasty came along 120 years later. With Egypt conquered, Cambyses plans 3 more military expeditions, all of which fail catastrophically and result in the king losing his mind. The first of these expeditions is to Carthage, the great trading city in modern-day Tunisia. Carthage was a colony of the Phoenician city of Tyre, which was one of many Phoenician cities that dotted the coast of the Levant. The absorption of the Phoenician cities into the Persian Empire is an extremely historically significant event that Herodotus doesn't really spend much time on. It seems that these wealthy trading cities submitted to Persian rule willingly, and were therefore allowed to keep a certain measure of autonomy and self-rule. They also, as well as adding massively to the wealth of the great king, gave him something that he had never had before: a navy. The Persians were not a coastal or seafaring people in the same way that the Greeks and the Phoenicians were. When they invaded Egypt, it seems that all of their ships were Phoenician. Their entire presence at sea at this point seems to have been Phoenician. The Persians relied on these people, and that may be why, when they refused outright to go to war against their kinsmen, the Carthaginians, Cambyses was forced to back down. So Cambyses focuses his efforts on the second expedition, against the Ammonians, a people who lived in the Libyan desert west of Egypt. He sends a great army westwards to go and subdue this tribe, and that great army is never seen again. They simply disappear. Herodotus, who's relying on an account given by the Ammonians themselves, says that a great sandstorm buried this army in the desert. The third expedition, and the most disastrous, led by King Cambyses himself, was going to go south against the Ethiopians, to fight the people that Herodotus called the tallest and best-looking people on earth. Cambyses sends spies south into Ethiopia, disguised as messengers. The plan is that they're going to get close to the Ethiopian king and try and gather as much information as possible. But the king of Ethiopia sees right through their disguise. He accuses the messengers outright of spying, and he has a real go at Cambyses for being greedy, for coveting the lands of people other than his own. The Ethiopian king then inspects the gifts that these Persian messengers have brought, the first of which is a fine purple cloak, and he asks how it is that the Persians have clothes of such fine colours. And the messengers tell him, well, we have this process called dyeing. We crush up, seashells, and it makes our clothes go purple. The next gift is a bottle of fine perfume, and the Ethiopian king asks what this liquid is, and the Persians say, oh, it's a scent, you put it on yourself to make yourself smell nice. This amuses the king of Ethiopia, who thinks this whole thing is an excellent metaphor for what the Persians themselves are like. Just as they veiled their true intentions when they came to him claiming to be just messengers, they are also deceptive in how they look and how they smell. This accusation that they were liars or they were being dishonest would have been especially cutting to the Persians. As Herodotus points out, there is no sin more shameful in Persia than being a liar, and there is no virtue more honourable than being honest. The only gift that the Persians bring that really impresses this king of Ethiopia is a cask of fine wine. Herodotus then tells us that the people in Ethiopia lived to be 120 years old, due to their access to a spring that has magical qualities, like the Fountain of Youth. Herodotus speaks very highly of the Ethiopians, and of Ethiopia itself. In his description, it's an almost magical land. Now, it's worth noting that Ethiopia is one of those countries that Herodotus talks about in some detail, but definitely never visited. As far as we can tell, the people of ancient Ethiopia did not live to extreme old ages, and they had no fountain of youth. Ethiopia's function in Herodotus's narrative is to provide a contrast to Persian imperialism. The uncivilized Ethiopians, who have so much less than the Persians do, also can't seem to wrap their heads around the idea of coveting what other people have, whilst the Persians, the wealthiest and most powerful people on earth, also suffer from this relentless drive to have more, to add to their possessions. This is probably not an accurate reflection of historical reality in ancient Ethiopia, and it reminds me a little bit of the noble savage trope that we see a lot nowadays. The idea that primitive and uncivilized societies are unburdened by the desires and worries that corrupt the advanced and civilized peoples. The king of Ethiopia then sends the spies home with a gift of his own and a warning for Cambyses. He sends the Persian king a massive bow and arrow, a huge one with an immense draw strength, and he says to the Persian king, "When your people can draw bows of this size with ease, then maybe consider that you can march against the Ethiopians. In the meantime, consider yourself lucky that we do not wish to rule any lands other than our own." Cambyses is so infuriated by this response that he immediately marches on Ethiopia. In fact, he marches away so quickly that he neglects to pack any supplies or organize any logistics to keep his army fed. As a result, the Persians march south into Africa and promptly begin to starve. At first, they eat their pack animals and their horses, and then they try eating grass. But eventually, starvation leads the Persians to making the worst, most terrible decision. They draw lots, and 1 in every 10 men is killed and cooked to feed the other 9. Seeing this, Cambyses returns to Egypt, leaving Ethiopia very much unconquered. Now, in my personal opinion, I think realistically it's quite unlikely that a seasoned commander like King Cambyses would actually neglect to pack any supplies for an expedition to Ethiopia. The story of Cambyses' hubris and his failure is likely a fiction, or at the very least an exaggeration. Archaeological digs have revealed absolutely no evidence of the so-called lost army of Cambyses, and they have tried. It could still be out there, the Libyan desert is big, but so far we have nothing. But for Herodotus, the expedition to Ethiopia and its utter failure marks the beginning of Cambyses' madness. Before Ethiopia, Cambyses was merely a cruel and greedy man. Upon returning, he is truly insane. Cambyses arrives back in Egypt with the remnants of his army to find the locals partying. This celebration was part of the festival of Apis, the Egyptian bull god, but Cambyses thought that these newly conquered and rebellious Egyptians were celebrating his defeat and his humiliation. Cambyses demanded to be shown this Apis bull that everyone was celebrating. Now, the Apis bull was a living cow that the Egyptians revered. They pampered it and took care of it, believing that it was the living incarnation of their god. And when it died, they would select a new Apis bull. Cambyses sees this Apis bull, and he draws his dagger from his belt and stabs it in its thigh. This wound kills the Apis, and Cambyses laughs. "Is this your god? An animal of flesh and blood that can be wounded and killed?" And then he puts many of the Egyptian priests to death. This is the form that the madness of Cambyses takes. It's not just random acts of violence and cruelty. To be fair, that was more or less part and parcel of being a king at this time. Cambyses' madness comes in the form of him disrespecting and disregarding long-established customs and traditions. Herodotus has already shared his view that customs and cultures exist for a reason and ought to be respected, no matter where they come from. He started Book 1 with the story of Gyges, the bodyguard, whose king demanded that he ought to see his wife naked, and Gyges warned the king that it was against custom for a servant to see his mistress without clothes on, and custom exists for a reason. Herodotus tells the story of a later Persian king who conducted a little anthropological experiment. He invited some of the Greeks and a tribe of Indians to his court, where he made them an offer. He went first to the Greeks and he said, "How much money would I have to give you for you to eat one of your dead relatives?" Now the Greeks, who practiced cremation, said that this was an abomination. No amount of money in the world would convince them to disrespect their dead so. The king then made this same offer to the Indian tribe, and amongst this specific tribe, respect for the dead was shown by cooking and consuming their flesh. And he said to this tribe, "How much money would I have to give you for you to burn one of your dead relatives instead of eating them?" And this tribe of Indians said, "No amount of money in the world. We would never desecrate the corpse of a loved one that way." This case study, so says Herodotus, proves the Greek poet Pindar right when he said that custom is the king of all. So, here's a list of the ways that Cambyses disrespected other people's cultures and his own. He dug up the mummy of Amasis, the pharaoh of Egypt that had insulted him, and attempted to mutilate it. But Amasis had been, properly mummified in the Egyptian way. He was a rock-solid corpse, could not be disfigured. So Cambyses burned his body instead. This insulted the Egyptians, as he had desecrated the corpse of one of their kings, and it insulted his own people, the Persians, who regarded fire as sacred and never burnt dead bodies. He opened the tombs of kings. He destroyed statues of the Egyptian gods, and he entered sanctuaries reserved only for priests. Cambyses married his own sisters, something that was fairly common amongst Egyptian royalty, but was absolutely against the law in Persia. He then murdered one of these sisters after she compared him unfavourably to their father. And he did this, by the way, while she was pregnant with his only child, killing both mother and baby alike. Cambyses was very fond of wine, and one day one of his advisors told him, "You know what, great king, we all think you're drinking just a little bit too much. Just a little bit too much. You might want to think about cutting back a little bit." And Cambyses responded by picking up his bow and arrow, going to the courtyard, and shooting this man's young son. When he had done this, he had the body of this young boy dissected, and he saw that the arrow had pierced his heart. He then turned to this advisor, and he said, "You see? Look at that. Perfect shot. Could a drunken madman pull off a perfect shot like that?" And this poor advisor, beholding the dissected remains of his child, just had to sheepishly say, "Yes, great king, you're perfect shot. I should never have insinuated that perhaps you were drinking too much." He also killed his younger brother. Cambyses did have a younger brother, a man called Smerdis, who made the king jealous by being the only Persian at court who could draw that great bow and arrow that the Ethiopian king had sent him as a gift. And also, in true Herodotean fashion, there is a prophetic dream. Cambyses dreams that he sees his younger brother sitting upon the throne of Persia, and so he preemptively assassinates him. And finally, he tried to kill Croesus. You guys remember Croesus, right, from Book 1, the king of Lydia who became like an advisor to the Persians? Well, he's still here, and he's still working for the Persians, and he has the cheek to try and advise Cambyses, as he had once advised his father, Cyrus, to act more moderately. But Cambyses is a very different man to Cyrus. Remember our character archetypes? Cambyses is an Agamemnon, an arrogant king who won't listen to advice. Cambyses tries to kill Croesus, but the old king of Lydia escapes, so Cambyses sends soldiers out to go and find him and kill him. Now the soldiers know their king. They know that at some point he's going to sober up, realise he's made a mistake and try and spare Croesus. So they capture the old man, but they don't kill him. And they were absolutely right. Cambyses wakes up the next morning with a terrible headache and he goes, "Oh God, I didn't order Croesus's execution last night, did I? Oh, someone rescind that." And the soldiers say, "Don't worry, great king, we knew you'd do this, so we have Croesus here alive and well for you." And Cambyses accepts this, he's very pleased. But then he puts his soldiers to death anyway for disobeying him. This, by the way, is the last time that Croesus appears in Herodotus's narrative. We don't really know what happened to him, but at this point in history he's probably like 80 years old, so there's a good chance that he dies quietly off screen. Or, even more likely, this whole story about him becoming a Persian advisor after he's dethroned is completely made up, and he died decades ago during the sack of Sardis. Either way, exit Croesus, one of Herodotus's best characters. So that's the madness of Cambyses, and as I'm sure many of you have probably guessed, kings like this don't usually reign for very long, and Cambyses' rule is about to come to a sudden and very dramatic end. Word reaches Cambyses that his younger brother Smerdis has rebelled against him and declared himself king back in Persia. How could this be? Cambyses had his younger brother murdered, remember? Well, upon questioning the messenger that brought the news, it becomes clear that this usurper is not the real Smerdis. He's an imposter, pretending to be the dead son of Cyrus to add to his legitimacy. Tragically, Cambyses' prophetic dream has come true. His younger brother is sitting on the throne of Persia. It's just not his real younger brother. Cambyses leaps into action. Literally, he leaps onto his horse ready to ride straight back to Persia, but he does so hastily that the tip of his scabbard breaks off and the end of his sword grazes his thigh. A fairly minor wound, but this is the ancient world. Medical science is really crude, so the wound very quickly becomes gangrenous and Cambyses dies. Herodotus tells us that the wound on Cambyses' thigh that killed him was in the exact same place that he had stabbed the sacred Apis bull. How very poetic. But probably untrue. Despite Herodotus' claim that Cambyses killed the Apis bull, Egyptian records, and the Egyptians were meticulous at keeping these kinds of records, show that no Apis bull died during the years of Cambyses' invasion and occupation. So is Herodotus just making this up? I mean, possibly. It fits very well with his narrative. But I think it's more likely that his Egyptian sources told him this story of Cambyses stabbing the sacred bull to make Persian rule in Egypt seem especially cruel and oppressive. After all, in the mid-5th century, which was roughly the time that Herodotus was travelling around Egypt, the Egyptians had just undergone a long, bloody and ultimately unsuccessful war for their independence. So Herodotus' sources might have had a certain anti-Persian feeling, which might have led to a little bit of historical revisionism regarding what the Persian invasion was actually like. So King Cambyses is dead, and an impostor sits upon the throne of the Persian Empire, pretending to be a son of Cyrus. What happens next is one of my favourite parts of Herodotus' stories, the conspiracy of the Seven. The Persian nobleman Atanes is the first person to suspect that all is not right in the house of the Persian king. His daughter is married to this new Persian king, and she writes to her father telling him all about her husband's strange ways. And he quickly deduces that this man is not who he says he is. The man calling himself Smerdis, son of Cyrus, is in fact a Median magus, a priest, using magic to fool the Persian people into thinking that he is the true king. Atanes puts together a team comprising of himself and 5 other noblemen. so now there are 6 that know the truth. They then invite a man called Darius, Cambyses' old spear-bearer and a very distant relative of the king, to come and join them. Darius already suspected that this Smerdis wasn't who he said he was, and he's relieved to find out that he wasn't the only one with suspicions. He's rearing to go. Let's go restore the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Let's kill this usurper. Let's go today, or let's go tomorrow. Either way, we have to start soon, before our conspiracy is found out. Atanes advises caution. He tells Darius, no, we need to make a detailed plan if we're going to overthrow a king. We need to scheme, we need to plot. But Darius says that is madness. That is completely misunderstanding how conspiracies work. Sooner or later, the king is going to find out about this, because you idiots are just inviting people willy-nilly into your conspiracy of named nobles, openly plotting to overthrow their king. Someone's going to talk. Hell, someone might already have talked. When you guys brought me in here and told me your entire plan, how did you know that I wasn't going to go straight to the king and betray you? You didn't, did you, you fools? And you know what? If you don't listen to me and act immediately, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Either we kill this usurper now, or we don't do it at all. Okay, says Atanes. What's your plan then? You do have a plan, don't you, Darius? And Darius says, actions speak louder than words. We are Persian noblemen. Persians don't think, they do. And Darius is absolutely right. They are some of the most senior men in Persia, so when they turn up at the royal palace with knives concealed in their clothes, no one gives them any hassle. But it all starts to go wrong when the palace eunuchs come out and try and stop them. The eunuchs refuse to grant entry to the conspirators, so at this point Darius whips off the mask, takes his knife out and cuts the eunuchs down. The 7 then barge into the palace and confront this false king. But, plot twist, there's not just one false king, there's 2. 2 Magi pretending to be one king. What a crazy story. The Magi try and defend themselves. One of them grabs a spear and the other one grabs a bow and arrow, but this one realises that a bow really isn't the weapon for close quarters and he flees. The one with the spear keeps on prodding away the conspirators. He takes out the eye of one of them and stabs another in the thigh. 5 of the 7 assassins stay behind to subdue the spear-wielding Magus, whilst Darius and his best buddy for life, Gabryas, chase down the other imposter. They find him in his bedroom, attempting to bar the entrance, but Gabryas throws himself into the door, grabs the Magus and knocks out all the lights. So in pitch darkness, the 2 men start wrestling with each other. Darius finally catches up, but it's pitch black, he can't see. So he just freezes with his knife in his hand. And Gabryas, who is fighting for his life on the floor, yells out, "Darius, what are you doing? Stab him already!" But Darius says, "I can't, it's too dark, I can't see who's who. What if I accidentally stab you?" And Gabryas says, "Oh, forget me, stab us both if you need to, just kill the Magus." So Darius goes in, he stabs, but he only kills the bad guy. After murdering the false king, the 7 conspirators gather and debate about what to do next. How should Persia be governed now that they have overthrown a king? Atanes, the guy who started this whole conspiracy, recommends that Persia should become a democracy. In a democracy, he says, the people benefit the most. He also points out some of the pitfalls of monarchy, the tendency of monarchs to become increasingly tyrannical and start abusing their powers. Megabyzus, one of the other conspirators, thinks that Persia should become an oligarchy, that the noble families should rule the country together and share power. He agrees with Atanes. Monarchy has lots of problems. Kings have a tendency towards vice and tyranny. But democracy has its own issues. The mob, the masses, are uneducated, and they tend towards brutality and short-term thinking. In an oligarchy, the ruling families can keep each other in check, make sure not one of them becomes too tyrannical, whilst at the same time still governing the country sensibly. Then Darius steps forward. He agrees with the previous speaker. He doesn't think the regular people are fit to run a country. Democracy's a terrible idea. But he points out that oligarchy might not be that much better. He predicts that if Persia were run by the oligarchs, the aristocrats would quickly fall to infighting, and a brutal struggle would ensue. At the end, the victor would crown himself king anyway, and he probably won't be the best man for the job, just the most brutal man who is capable of eliminating his rivals. Darius then posits a question. Which government is the best when it is run as its best? A good democracy, a good oligarchy, or a good monarchy? And he concludes that the best form of government is a good monarchy, when a just king has absolute power to rule properly. Darius then finishes his argument by reminding his fellow conspirators that Persia has always been a monarchy, and with the exception of Cambyses, it has always served them well. After all, could Cyrus have conquered this great big empire had he not enjoyed absolute power as Persia's king? And so the conspirators, funnily enough, vote on what form of government they're going to run Persia with, and 4 of the 7 vote for monarchy, so Persia will continue to be ruled by kings. This whole discussion is fascinating. It's the most detailed ideological debate in the whole of Herodotus's histories, and Herodotus himself insists that this discussion actually happened, despite the fact that many Greeks deny it. And yeah, I have to agree with Herodotus's critics here. I don't think this discussion actually happened. It's just too Greek to be Persian, if you know what I mean. One speaker always disproving the last person who spoke. The tri-division of government types into 3 broad categories: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. It just reeks of 5th century classical Greek intellectualism, the movement that Herodotus was a part of. These are the words of 5th century Athenian philosophers, not 6th century Persian noblemen. At least, that's my impression. If there are any Achaemenid experts out there watching this and you think I'm wrong, please let me know down below. And so that is how Persia was saved and the Achaemenid dynasty of Cyrus the Great restored to power. At least that's what Darius told everybody. And in case you haven't already guessed, this guy Darius is going to be Persia's next king. Herodotus's version of events, you know, this coup and the conspiracy of the 7, is very close to the account that Darius himself had carved into the side of a mountain in western Iran. The Behistun inscription, written in 3 languages, tells a very similar story to Herodotus, with the exception that in the Persian version there is only 1 magus, not 2. So Darius becomes king, and he immediately starts sorting this empire out. He divides it into administrative zones called satrapies, each one run by a governor called a satrap. Darius is a real statesman, the kind of organised boss that you want in charge of a massive unwieldy empire like the Persian one. Herodotus tells us that the Persians themselves called King Cyrus the father, Cambyses the tyrant, but Darius they called the shopkeeper or the retailer. But the start of his rule would not be simple. Herodotus tells us in his histories, and Darius tells us himself in his inscription, that this coup and the instability it led to caused rebellions throughout the empire amongst the more independently minded provinces. Specifically, Babylon, a region of the empire that we've already noted was by far the richest, decided that after all of this chaos, it was the perfect time to throw off the Persian yoke. The Babylonians took this bid for independence very seriously. As soon as they declared their open rebellion, they put to death every woman in the city other than those with children. They understood that the Persians would besiege them and supplies would quickly run out. They simply didn't have enough to feed everybody, so they put to death anyone who couldn't fight. This may sound brutal and horrible, and I imagine it really was, but this is ancient warfare, remember? There are very few rules. Whatever the Babylonians did to their own people, it was nothing compared to what the Persians would do to them if they got in. So Darius besieges Babylon, but without all of those extra mouths to feed, the city endures. After a year and 7 months of siege, Darius begins to despair of ever taking the city. But one of Darius's soldiers devised a plan. A young man called Zopyrus cut off his own nose and mutilated his face, and then went to go and see the king. Upon seeing him, Darius was furious and demanded to know who had done this to him. Zopyrus responded that he had done this to himself. It was all part of his plan to finally capture the city. He apologized to the king and said, "I'm sorry I kept this plan from you, but I knew that if I told you that it involved me making my face unrecognizable, you would never consent to it. But now the deed is done, I've cut my own nose off. Are you willing to trust me and follow through on this plan?" "Okay," says Darius, "I suppose you've left me no choice. What's the plan?" Zopyrus says that he's going to pretend to defect to the Babylonians, and he's going to trick them into making their city vulnerable. He tells Darius that that night he will run to the walls of Babylon, and in 10 days' time, Darius should select 1,000 expendable men and put them within sight of the city, where they can't be helped. 7 days after that, he should do the same thing, but this time with 2,000 men. And then 20 days after that, send 4,000 men to within sight of Babylon's walls. The very next day after doing this, Darius should attack the city from all angles, but keep some of his elite Persian soldiers in reserve, ready to take one specific gate. So that night, Zopyrus approached the walls of Babylon, looking over his shoulder the whole way to make it appear as if he feared he was being followed. He asked the Babylonians to please let him in, and they did, and upon seeing his face, mutilated and hideous, they asked what happened to him. Zopyrus says that it was King Darius who did this to him, as a punishment for daring to suggest that the siege was lost and the Persians ought to abandon the city. Now he wants to offer his services to the Babylonians and get his revenge, and he can be very helpful. He knows the Persian plans inside out. The Babylonians believe him, and 10 days later, Zopyrus leads a small force of defenders out against 1,000 vulnerable-looking Persians, and he massacres all of them. 7 days later, he kills 2,000 Persians, and 20 days after that, he kills 4,000. This is enough to convince all of the Babylonians that his defection was genuine, and he's hailed as a hero throughout the city and given complete command over Babylon's defences. The next day, as instructed, Darius attacks Babylon from all angles, and whilst the Babylonians are desperately fighting to keep the Persians off the walls, Zopyrus slips away to one specific gate, opens it, and allows a small force of elite Persian soldiers inside. And before you know it, the whole city had fallen. Darius did not show the same mercy to the Babylonians as Cyrus had. As soon as he took the city, he tore down its walls and impaled 3,000 of the most prominent defenders. The remainders, however, he pardoned and allowed to keep living in Babylon. Darius also notices the complete lack of women inside the city, due to the fact that the defenders had, put them all to death before the siege began. So he sent quotas out to the other provinces of his empire, asking for a certain number of young women from each area to help repopulate Babylonia. As a reward for his cunning and self-sacrifice in taking the city, Zopyrus was granted overlordship of Babylon and a lifelong tax exemption, a fine reward and a sign of the king's favour. But regardless, Darius was heard to say for the rest of his life that he would give 20 Babylons to see Zopyrus without his injuries. Book 3 ends with this somewhat bittersweet victory. Despite the madness of Cambyses, the duplicity of the Magi, the chaos of the coup, and the somewhat distressing manner in which Babylon is recaptured, Persia has survived. The empire endures, and is still very much a success story. All of that will change in Book 4, when the Persians meet the Scythians.